Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just waiting for Hamza to start the broadcasting. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we were waiting for Brother Hamza to start the broadcast remotely, and he did. It's good to really be back among you, brothers and sisters. It has been 6 weeks, by now 7 weeks since I left to Palestine. And alhamdulillah, it was a fruitful trip. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showered His blessings on us, spending about 18 days out of the 6 weeks and at Masjid al-Aqsa, alhamdulillah. So that was really the best part in this trip, and then seeing the relatives and the friends in this regard. I was planning to talk about the trip and reflecting on the trip because I have heard a few questions here and there. But because of the too many events that took place this past week, I decided to talk about the latest on Lebanon and on Gaza. And until I left, we were discussing Gaza specifically and saying that the situation in Lebanon, cross-border skirmishes are under control. And at that point, there was some voices within the Zionists establishment saying that we need to do something in Lebanon. But those voices were not really prominent. Once in a while we hear, the defense minister said we're gonna turn attention to the north, but there was nothing really indicating that. However, with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the head of the Hamas, about 5 weeks ago, we start seeing some changes where it became clear that the Israeli government is having trouble at home. And this turning point, if we can call it, was really the discovery of 6 hostages who were killed in Gaza. They were Israeli hostages that were alive until a few days before, and the government came and says, we discovered 6 bodies. Now, there was an uproar within the families of the hostages and their supporters, saying basically the government had failed them, that the bodies are coming dead, not alive, and blaming Netanyahu mainly for a lack of a ceasefire in Gaza, and in talking and supporting a ceasefire and demonstration start really increasing around the country that something needs to be done to rescue the rest of the hostages. And increasingly, lots of pressure was applied on the government by the opposition, and even with support of some people within the government, like the defense Minister Gallant, who is part of the cabinet. What I need to point out here is that we had two cases where the Israelis discovered bodies in Gaza. This was one of them, and a few months back, they also discovered 3 bodies. Within the same framework, the same time framework, we have the Israelis releasing 90 bodies of people who were killed in Gaza and kept with the Israelis at that point. It was not, a big time span. And after those 6 were released and given to the Israelis saying their location, the Israelis released so many bodies also from Gaza. And this really says that the Israelis did not discover them. My reading is that the Egyptian intelligence worked between Hamas and the Israelis, tit for tat, we'll give you some hostages, we need the bodies back. And in the 2 occasions, that's what happened. In fact, when the 90 bodies were released to Gaza, there was an uproar among the families of the hostages in Israel and their supporters. How could you give them 89 bodies when our bodies are dead in Gaza and we cannot get them? But of course, the Israeli government cannot say, no, we are cutting a deal. We are cutting a deal. We got them by cutting a deal. We got the bodies of 6 of them. And I think that was the second was a smart move by Hamas because it created so much actions within the establishment, the political and the people against the government. And Netanyahu have nothing to say, nothing to offer. And he would meet with the hostages and he was blasted left and right. And they will, call him names. Even among the politicians in the Knesset, the opposition, they say that, you are really responsible for those bodies. You are responsible. Because we could have taken them alive. They were only killed a few days back. And that's, I think, was a point when the Israeli government, being surrounded from the opposition in the Knesset, from the people, where hundreds of thousands went on demonstration and closed the streets, and there was clashes, and you could see it on Israeli TV and international TV, police beating people and taking some of them to prison and this and this and that. This pushed the government to go in another direction. Because remember, at one point we talked about that Netanyahu is dragging all of this to the US election. He's just buying time. He wants to get to the US election, and indirectly you have seen the signs he's supporting Trump, thinking that if Trump can't come to power, then we can cut the deal because we will have the full support of the US government behind us. And we do not need to deal with Biden and company. Although Biden has been supporting the Zionists with tens of tons of weapons, all this killing that have been genocide in Gaza is all with US weapons. The US thinking that we can somehow influence Netanyahu, but he has been making a fool out of Biden. How many times did he lie to Biden? To the point that in the Israeli press, in Haaretz, there was this article, Biden, don't listen to what Netanyahu says in English. Listen to him when he speaks Hebrew. Because he has been fooling him. How many times, he gave him the impression, after, just before Ramadan, that he can accept a ceasefire. To the point that Biden went public and said Monday there will be a ceasefire, just before Ramadan. And we know what had happened. Netanyahu found a way out. So with this reality, we start seeing score of army regiment, reserves mostly, being shifted from Gaza to the north. What do you mean by the north? On the boundaries with Lebanon. And at one point, within a week or two, you start seeing almost every 2-3 days an announcement of, this part of the army is taken toward the north. This part of the army is taken toward the north. In Gaza, it's now a low-level engagement, and we need the army in the north. Why? My thinking is the following, that the Netanyahu government have put 3 objectives for the war in Gaza. Defeating Hamas once and for all, releasing the hostages alive, and the third one is de-radicalization of Gaza. And after a year of bombing and genocide, and we have more than 41,000 shaheed. We have at least 10 to 20,000 who are under the rubble. UN says more than 75% of Gaza is destroyed, the housing. And then we have about 70 to 100,000 injured. That is the achievement. That's what Netanyahu can say, I did this in Gaza. But that's not a victory. That's not an achievement. It's not something that you can sell to the public. They keep asking him, where are the hostages? Where are the hostages? Where are the hostages? And they realize until the US election, it seems that after a year not able to achieve any of the 3 objectives. In fact, the US military experts saying Hamas is still very strong in Gaza. And you can see it clearly that whenever the Israelis evacuate an area in Gaza, within 15 minutes, not a day or two, within 15 minutes, Hamas is in charge of that area. They just come somehow, somewhere from all those tunnels. And how many times did the Israeli army had to go back to an area that evacuate? So they realized that this is not going anywhere. And they made a decision to shift the focus totally from Gaza to Lebanon. That decision was made, although it was not explicit initially, other than saying we are moving those reserve soldiers, because the bulk of the soldiers are reserve. And they called back 30,000 reserve soldiers. Those reserve soldiers are supposed to come and serve for a week or two, a month or two, but not for a year in this regard. So that was the indication that really they are turning their back on Gaza. Let's just keep killing 20, 30 people a day in Gaza, 40, 50 people a day. Let's just keep doing this and get the focus on Lebanon. I will come to Lebanon with some details later on. But that really changed the dynamic of the whole situation. For the past 6 weeks that I was in Palestine, every day you have a statement coming from the US government or Egypt or Qatar that we are working on a ceasefire. We are working on a ceasefire. We are very close to a ceasefire. We nailed all except 1 or 2 items. And then you say Netanyahu is adding a new stuff. And then they go back to square one. They start doing it, and this has been going for at least 2 months. But it became more clear in the last 6 weeks. Now, suddenly, we start seeing in the Israeli media that the prospect for a ceasefire in Gaza, this was about 2 weeks ago, is null. Meaning, forget it, there will not be a ceasefire. During the time of Biden. As long as Biden is there, there's no ceasefire. And what the Americans are discussing, and they are meeting with the Egyptians and with the Qataris, and the thing is, the American officials come and go and meet with Qatari officials and Egyptian officials, as if the problem is with the Egyptian and the Qatari and the Hamas. The problem mainly was with Netanyahu. There's no doubt about it. But criminals like Blinken, a Zionist himself, who went to Palestine after the events of October 7, saying, I came here as a Jew. I mean, you are a Secretary of State of America. Who you are representing? So this guy kept saying, the problem is Hamas, the problem is Hamas, the problem is Hamas. And Qatar and Egypt saying, the problem is Netanyahu. The problem is Netanyahu. And that was crystal clear. So basically, this ceasefire idea, as of 2 weeks ago, start evaporating. And in the Israeli press, as I said, you start seeing, as long as, Netanyahu is here, he will not agree to a ceasefire until maybe after the administration, if he will. So that became clear. And while this has been discussed, there was a shift in the army from Gaza. They start taking army from Gaza and slowly sending it toward the north. Of course, Palestine has borders with how many countries? They have borders with Lebanon. Palestine has borders with Syria. Palestine has borders with Jordan. And Palestine has borders with Egypt, right? So we have, all those borders that are there. Lebanon, that we will come on a little later with some details, suddenly you start having the army amassed in Lebanon for the past year, the engagement between Hezbollah and Israel was very, very measured. Very, very measured. And Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, will come to this, have mentioned that if the Israelis hit this part, we will hit this part inside Palestine. If they hit more, we'll hit more. If they hit the airport in Beirut, Rafiq al-Hariri airport, we're going to hit Tel Aviv airport. I mean, that was clear, tit for tat. Meaning, if you keep this low, just, send us a missile or two per day, we'll send you a missile or two per day to the north. This is public information. This is not something secret. And we'll talk about the dynamics a little later. So that's basically where the shift happened. That since the Netanyahu government could not come with a victory, something that they call, we succeeded, we won, we did this, they said that we have to change the dynamics and the strategy and make the focus on Lebanon, not on Gaza, because Gaza cannot produce for them anything that they can be proud of, other than, we killed 40,000 plus. There are so many people under the rebels. We destroyed the education system in Gaza. We destroyed the water system in Gaza. We destroyed this. I mean, you cannot just come to the people of Israel and say, we did this, and then they will ask you, how about the hostages? How about the objectives in this regard? So that change is very important to recognize that they were looking for a victory. They were saying that Netanyahu at that point in the poll, his votes would be less than the opposition if there was election. And some of the opposition members were calling for election. So that's yet another reason, is to try to grab some kind of a popular support, and we cannot get it through Gaza. We're going to try to do it through Lebanon. Also, if you study the Zionists in Palestine and their strategy, as the Quran says, whenever they make an agreement, some of them will break it. Whenever they make an agreement, some of them will break it. That has been taught to this ummah a long time ago. So those people do not really accept an agreement. They agree to something, and they know deep down that we need at one point to break it and get to another issue. Take Oslo as an example. Oslo agreement, that the Zionists in front of the whole world committed to an agreement with the Palestinians. And when there was an attack on Netanyahu a few weeks back, by who? By the army and by the defense minister. He came up with a wild idea. He said, we need to finish the UNRWA, the UN organization that deals with the Palestinian refugees and provide food and supplies to Gaza with the US pressure. So to do this in Gaza, he said to the army chief, the Israeli army from now on have to take this responsibility of distributing the supplies, the humanitarians, the food and the supplies. And the army said, no way. You know, this is the prime minister telling the head of the army, this is your task. He said, no way. We will not accept this task. We have enough on our hand. We have enough on our hand. So the army defied him and said, we will not do this. And Gallant started talking publicly that it's Netanyahu that is blocking the agreement, and that the first priority should be the hostages, getting the hostages alive. So he went public. Netanyahu went public and says that the army, the intelligence service, and the defense establishment are all leftist, and they are the Oslo people. He called them the Oslo people, which means, oh, the Oslo is something dirty. Yeah, we agreed to the Oslo, but to get something done, and then we'll go our own way. Imagine he called the army establishment, the defense establishment, the intelligence establishment publicly. He would probably said those are the leftists. Those are the Oslo people. So it's out of that frustration of what to do that all of this led to the shift that we have seen in Lebanon. So let's now, inshallah, talk for a few minutes about Lebanon, give you the background to understand what is happening in Lebanon and what is Lebanon and why this situation have got to this point where no mention of a Lebanese army, no mention of a Lebanese president, no mention of anything in Lebanon other than Hezbollah. How did we get to this point? How did we get to this point? Needless to say, of course, when I say no mention of president, because Lebanon does not have a president. For the last 2.5 years, Lebanon does not have a president. They cannot get together to elect a president. The president have to be a Maronite Christians. We'll explain. But Hezbollah have a big chunk of support in the parliament by Hezbollah members. And guess who? a Christian faction. I mean, you should have seen before these events the picture of all those young men and women with crosses, and hanging, the picture of Hassan Nasrallah. What? What's going on? We'll explain. Let's start from the 1860s. Not the 1960s, the 1860s. Going through this quickly. So the Lebanon was part of the greater Syria, just like Lebanon, Palestine, and Transjordan. All of this was under the Uthmani Khilafah. And in Lebanon, the Mount of Lebanon, there is at that point two groups that were always have problems among themselves and friction. The Druze and the Maronite Christians. The Druze and the Maronite Christians. Although the majority, were Muslims, but they did not have, much into this. The Druze have the upper hand in Lebanon over the Christians in Mount of Lebanon, Jabal Lebanon at that point. So there were these massacres that took place between the Druze, of course, who are not Muslims. We discussed them before. But, they ally themselves with the Muslims. But at that point, they were on their own, in control in the Mount of Lebanon. And the Christians were subjugated to them. So the British and the French started these massacres through their influence there and brought their navies. The British Navy came to Lebanon and sided with the Druze, and the French Navy came to Lebanon and sided with the Maronites. And both of them got together and forced the Uthmani ruler to give special status for Lebanon. And of course, the state of the Uthmanis was really, in the last 100 years, was decaying. And the British and the French and the Russians and the Germans and all of this, everyone wants a piece of the Ottomans. That's why, for example, when Napoleon came and took over Egypt, who helped the Uthmanis to get rid of Napoleon? It was the British Navy, the British Army. Because everyone wants this piece of this Muslim land when it's going to be divided. So Lebanon was the center of this. And it's very interesting, by the way, to note that during the time of the Umayyad Khilafah, the Khalifa thought that it's dangerous to keep this concentration of Maronites in the Mount of Lebanon. The idea was they should live under the Muslim land, but they should not be together because it's a potential danger down the road. And Imam al-Awza'i, a very well-known, respected Imam, came to the Khalifa and said, we have an agreement with them. You cannot really disperse them. They are Ahlul Kitab living under the state of Islam. If they are not doing anything, fishy, funny, just leave them. So it was Imam al-Awza'i who stood in front of the Khalifa, who was looking at the political implication down the road. Yeah, it took 1,000 years, but he was eventually right. The Khalifa, that is. So, Lebanon given a special status, and when the agreement between the British and the French to divide the Uthmani Khilafah land in the Middle East came, Lebanon became part of the assets that the French took over and colonized, same as Syria. While Jordan and Palestine, Iran and Iraq and Egypt went to the British. So the British at one point tried to go back and take over Syria by putting Sharif, one of the Sharif's children, Sharif Hussein, King Faisal, to be a king of Syria. They sent him to Syria. They taught us in books of history that the Syrian people have kicked King Faisal out of Syria. Absolute nonsense. It was the French who kicked him out of Syria. Because, the agreement was France is, Lebanon is for us. Syria is for us, not for you. So what did the French do in Lebanon? They start building this separate entity from Syria. And they start giving power to who? To the Maronite Christians. They even built a college to graduate leaders from among them called the Jesuit College, Kulliya al-Yasu'iyya. It's still there in Lebanon. The Americans later on came and established the American University of Beirut. And of course, the British have their own incubator of leaders in Egypt that called the Victoria College, which graduate King Hussein and all those, princes that could see in Jordan and Saudi and beyond. So there was this plan to take over, not just by name politically, but really deep. And the French came and put the Maronites in power. And they drafted eventually a constitution that the president of Lebanon need to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament a Shiite Muslim. Believe it or not, this stands until today. At that time, they said, oh, the Christians are majority. They were not. They were not. In fact, it's a fact that when Palestinians were kicked out of Palestine in 1948, after the massacres that took place by the Zionists, many Palestinians went to Syria and Lebanon. And the Christians, Palestinians who went to Lebanon, were given citizenship. That's a fact. They were given. Why? To increase the number of the Christians. We say we are majority. But again, even today, when the Muslims are a great majority, this law still stands. So, for many years, the Maronite Christians in Lebanon had the presidency, they had the political power, they have the army, and they have the economy in their hand. If you have the presidency, if you have the political power, if you have the economy, if you have the army, basically what? You have the country. And all along, Muslims were weakened and weakened more and more and more and more in Lebanon. Same thing with the Druze influence. Was weakened more and more. Lebanon, under the Uthmanis, used to have many, many different ethnicities and groups and religions. They came from all over. Under the Uthmani Khilafah at the end, beginning of the 20th century, there were 200 millisystems. 200. There was the Orthodox Christians, the Maronite Christians, they were the Druze, they were the people who came from Armenia, the Armenian Christians. Go to Palestine, there's a whole area called the Armenian Quarter. And in Lebanon, they have an Armenian presence. There were also from other places that came to Jordan, like the Shishan and Sharkas and this and that. So it was really a place where you see all sort of, Lebanon was a sample for this. Until early 70s. In early 70s, there was a civil war in Jordan. And after the civil war, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its armed groups were kicked out of Jordan to Lebanon. The Arab leaders made an arrangement that they went to Lebanon. Naturally, although the PLO is a secular organization, naturally, the Maronites start looking at the situation and saying that, we have a problem at our hands. If those Palestinian Muslims mostly will ally themselves with the Muslims and will support the Muslims, then our position of power in Lebanon is threatened. So in 1975, the Maronite Christians started a civil war in Lebanon that lasted for 15 years, that destroyed Lebanon. The army disintegrated. So the army is composed of Muslims, Shiite, Muslims, Sunni, Christians, Druze. So when the army disintegrated, the Muslims, Sunni, went to the Sunni groups, the Shiite Muslims went to the Shiite groups, the Maronites went to their own Maronite groups, and the Druze went to the Druze group. Which at that time the Druze was headed by a very famous politician of Lebanon by the name of Kemal Jumblat, who is the father of this drunken guy that still heads the Druze. And naturally, again, when the Palestinians was the target of this civil war and the army disintegrated, Palestinians start arming and training the Muslims in Lebanon. And the Palestinians, the Sunni Muslims, some of the Shiites that we're going to talk about a little later, and the leftists in general, and the Druze became one body against the Christians in Lebanon, and war broke, and they were able to defeat the Christians badly. They really shake the ground from under them, and they almost got them totally to submit. During those few years, there was a person in Lebanon, famous name again. I know those names do not, sound to your ear, but at that time, you would hear them all the time, see them all in the news. I mean, at that point, I was in high school, so I would read the paper every day, and you could see them almost. Musa Sadr, Ayatollah Musa Sadr in Lebanon. So Musa Sadr worked with the PLO to train a new Shiite group. Because Shia did not have, again, the Muslims in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, after what the French have done, very weak in Lebanon, have no weight. Although they are the majority, they have no weight. Just like in South Africa, when few whites were controlling everything in the country and the majority of the blacks have nothing. In Lebanon, it's of course different situation, but the same. The majority Muslims have no power. Oh, the Prime Minister, he's really working for the President. And the Speaker of the Parliament, again, working for the system. Not much is happening. And everyone was happy with the arrangement in this regard, the corrupted Sunni leadership and the corrupted Shiite leadership in this regard. Kemal Jumblat was a little different. He was a revolutionary. And a respected politician in the Arab world and beyond. So when those guys got together and the PLO start training some of those Shiites to become a Shiite militant group with military, they form a group called Amal. And among the early members of Amal is someone by the name of Hassan Nasrallah. So this Amal group, with a strong really relationship to this As-Sadr and Nabih Barri, who was the Speaker of Parliament, they start gaining some strength. Now, the West, especially France and the US, would not allow the Muslims to take over Lebanon. So there was this arrangement where the US gave the green light to Hafez al-Assad of Syria to invade Lebanon and take over Lebanon and fight the Palestinians and the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims and the Druze and the left and put the Christians back on their feet. And that's what had happened. So Syria invaded Lebanon and took over Lebanon. And fought, as I said, the left and the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims and the Druze and their supporters. And again, as I said, the army, the Lebanese army, no more, it disintegrated. Each part of the army went to their own groups. Of course, later on, the Syrians will fight the Christians because the Christians got the support of the Israelis and start asking the Syrians to leave Lebanon. And then Hafez al-Assad turned on the Christians. In fact, Michel Aoun, who was a major figure at that time, later on went to exile and came back from France and became the president of Lebanon after working with the Christians, with the Syrians. Michel Aoun fled Lebanon. The Syrians were after him to capture him and kill him. And he was smuggled in the car of the French ambassador to Beirut. He was smuggled to the embassy so the Syrians cannot reach him. And then he was flown to France, where he was kept for a few years until he came back and became the president, working with the Syrians. But that's a different dynamics. If you need more information, you can read about it. But as I said, at one point when the Christians stood on their feet, they start working with the Israelis. Will come what was the circumstances that the Syrians turned against the Christians and somehow became allies with the others. The main objective was really not to make a group in Lebanon too victorious over the rest. So Amal, the Hezbollah military group, was really small in size, growing, again with the training and the help of the Palestinians. And in early 80s, 1982, the Israeli government decided to intervene in Lebanon because Syria have taken over Lebanon. The Israelis felt that to get the balance back, they need to take a big part of Lebanon and kick the Palestinian army, those the PLO, out of Lebanon. So they invaded Lebanon and they reached Beirut. And they kept bombing Beirut day after day, week after week. So the Syrian army is in Lebanon, and it's as if nothing is happening. So Syria did not fight with the Israelis. They did not see them as a threat. This is your section of Lebanon. This is my section of Lebanon. The US made arrangements between the PLO and the Israelis for the PLO to leave Lebanon safely. And Arafat and his people left Lebanon and went to mainly Tunisia, Sudan, Yemen, and other countries. In Lebanon, there is a large number of Palestinian refugees who came after 1948 and maybe some after 1967. Same thing in Syria and Jordan. So the PLO was protecting the Palestinian camps. And those camps have, each camp tens of thousands of people. So when the PLO took their arms and left with their arms, Sharon was in charge, who later became prime minister. And they were working very closely with the Maronites. So one night, Sharon gave the orders to the Israeli army to let the Christian Maronites into the Palestinian camps and close the area so that those Maronites can do whatever they want as a revenge to those all years of war. And the Maronite Christians went to the Palestinian camps and massacred so many people. I mean, the pictures are still on the internet. You get sick of seeing them. They killed people with knives, with machetes, and all sorts of things. Hundreds of women, children were massacred in their homes. And as I said, the pictures are there. And he let the Christians out. And then there was this big scandal within Israel. How could you, Sharon, do this? He was forced to resign. Just to say, we are moral people. What morality? I mean, the government was well aware of what they were doing. But this is the nature of those Zionists. So if you go and Google Sabra and Shatila, I mean, those massacres, I mean, pictures, of course, as I said, at that point, this was late 1970s, 77, 76, around that time. And this was a phase of the war, of the civil war in Lebanon. One of the most famous families in Maronites are the Christian family of Al-Jumayl family, who established the Phalangist party, Hizb al-Kataib, that played and started the civil war. At one point, his son, who was the head of this militia, was voted to become the president of Lebanon. And Bashir al-Jumayl came and said, the Israelis should withdraw and the Syrians should withdraw, and suddenly there was a big bomb and he was dead. He was the strongest person among the Maronites, and he was dead. On the Druze side, we mentioned Kamal Jumblat. Kamal Jumblat wrote a book. It's called Lebanon, This Is My Will. Very, very interesting book. Lubnan هذه وصيتي. In the book, he said, we in Lebanon, the leftists and the communists and what have you, we were hoping and thinking that Hafez al-Assad in Syria will be on our side. That's what he said in the book. But he said very clearly, Hafez al-Assad already crossed, that he was, with the Soviet Union and all of this. But he said clearly, Hafez al-Assad already crossed the line and he went to Washington, D.C., meaning he was working for the US government. Yes, in public he was anti-imperialism, anti-Americanism, but he was an agent for the US. Guess what happened to Kamal Jumblat? He was killed by the Syrians in a very vicious way. I mean, just to really illustrate and show, so no one will challenge Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar. There was also a writer, editor of Al-Hawadith magazine, who used to be very critical in Lebanon of Syria, what they are doing in there. The Syrians kidnapped him, and before they killed him, they took the flesh from his fingers. Said, you used to write with this hand? Those are the fingers that they used to write against us? While he's alive, they took the flesh out of those fingers, and then they killed him in a very vicious way. So basically that was the dynamic then. Now, in a way that was not clear to many, a new Shiite group started being established with total loyalty to Iran. So Amal was a Lebanese group with Lebanese connection. They were really having some relationship with Iran through As-Sadr, but not being a tool in the hand of Iran. So Iran started establishing an Iranian-supported organization in Lebanon, became known as Hezbollah, with total loyalty to Iran, believing in the aqidah and the ethics of what Khomeini came, something called Wilayat al-Faqih. Because remember, some of the Shiites, when the revolution in Iran, the Iran revolution came, they did not recognize Khomeini. They said Shiites should not have established a state until the Mahdi comes. But this group, Hezbollah, start from day one with total loyalty to Iran. And guess who will jump ship from Amal to Hezbollah? Hassan Nasrallah will jump ship, because basically they are not loyal enough to Iran, and he'll start disagreeing with them. He jumped ship, became part of Hezbollah, and start taking responsibility. Now, when the Israelis drove the Palestinians out of Lebanon with the US agreement, the US doing the agreement, what happened at that point is the US brought troops to Lebanon, and the French brought troops. You see, the French, they still think they control Lebanon. And they try to have along the way, each time they had to try a say. They were not realizing that the US is really cleaning the French influence in Lebanon. Because the struggle was between the French and the Americans of who will have full control over Lebanon. I mean, you saw the news today. The French foreign minister is visiting Beirut. They're still thinking that, we have a role to play. They are not. I mean, we'll explain how the Americans got them out. But they were the ones who protected Aoun when the Syrians who were supported by the US want to kill him. Now, I know that some of you are under the impression that Syria is against the US. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The Middle East, there's no country that have Russian influence to the point that they control that country. None. I will explain the issue of Syria and why the US worked with Russia to take over control of Syria militarily. We'll talk about this shortly. So when the Israelis kicked the Palestinians out and kept themselves in South Lebanon, the bulk of South Lebanon is what? Shiite Muslims. They were the poorest, the depressed, the deprived, and all those years, worthless in Lebanon. The Sunni were not far apart, but they were in a better position. In Beirut and in Trablus and beyond. So when the US brought forces, French brought their forces, because they still want, we are here. Suddenly there was this huge truck, big one, full with explosives. Went, one of them to the barracks where the US Marines live, sleep, and the other went to where the French. And major explosions took place, and hundreds of US troops and French troops were killed instantly. It shook Washington. And Reagan had to call the US Army out of Lebanon after that. Because there was so much outrage. How could this happen? You have hundreds of troops, and how could the truck comes and, So, the US government did not want really to have a fight within the country, so they start taking troops. Same thing with the French in this regard. Who did this? Of course, this new group that's called Hezbollah. And from that point, having the south, which is mostly Shiite Muslim, controlled by the Israelis, a fight started by Hezbollah against the Israelis. Who was supporting them? Of course, the Iranians, with money, with weapons, and of course, Syria, because those used to come through Syria, because Syria have an interest in getting the Israelis out of Lebanon, although they are not willing to fight them. And eventually, Hezbollah was able to drive the Israelis out after inflicting them with more than 600 killed. More than 600 Israeli soldiers were killed over the years, and eventually Israel announced that they're going to withdraw from Lebanon. And after that, Hezbollah became the dominant force in Lebanon. Basically, no one even can come close. Neither the Sunnis, nor the Maronites, nor the Druze. And they have projected their power. They have projected their power against the Christians and against the Sunnis and against everyone, that we are the dominant force in Lebanon. And indeed, they even have control of who will be the president. Because they start having a political section. They run for parliament and they became so popular. You have to imagine that the bulk of those Shiites in Lebanon who were, very poor, desperate, nothing, they have nothing. And then Hezbollah start having schools, start having charity organizations, start having hospitals, start having clinics, start having support for the Shiites. So suddenly they became a state within a state and slowly took over the country. That they were more powerful than the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army very weak compared with what Hezbollah has. There was no doubt about this. Hassan Nasrallah became the star of Lebanon. He was the head of Hezbollah. How did he become the head of Hezbollah? When Hezbollah was established, they put an Ayatollah to lead it by the name of Hassan Tufaili, Sheikh Hassan Tufaili. And Hassan Tufaili did not have loyalty to Iran. He's a Shiite cleric. He's authentic. He's not someone who is a sellout. So he was looking at Hezbollah to be a Lebanese group. And of course, Iran is not for this. So although he was the first head of Hezbollah, they orchestrated election within Hezbollah and they removed him and they brought Abbas Musawi to be the head of Hezbollah. Within a year, the Israelis assassinated Musawi. Within a year, he was with his wife and his daughter in the car. They bombed the car and him and his daughter and his wife were killed. Naturally, there was this growing personality within Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. He became the president or the head of Hezbollah in the early 90s. And with the withdrawal of the Israelis, he became, as I said, the star in Lebanon, the kingmaker in Lebanon, with the support of the Iran. Can someone get a chair to the doctor? Can you put a chair up front, the first? Just put it there, inshallah. So, barakallah fiqh. So, within this context, as I said, he became the kingmaker. He will decide who will be the president. Who's behind him? Iran. Now, who's behind the Sunnis? Unfortunately, Saudi. And who beside the Maronites? Lebanon. Maronites became, some of them loyalty to the French still, and some of them working with the US. And when we say Saudis, i.e. it's the US. So for Lebanon to have a president, the US and Iran would agree, otherwise there's no president. That's the reality. That's the reality. Now, in 2000 and 2006, there were clashes between the Hezbollah and the Israelis. And 2 years before that, there was an exchange of prisoners that again put the popularity of Hezbollah and Nasrallah way up in the sky of Lebanon. Basically, they were able to release hundreds of prisoners, Palestinians, Lebanese, and others from Israeli prisons by giving the Israelis some dead of their people who were killed in Lebanon, and they were still in Lebanon, and one guy who was flying and his plane came down in Lebanon. So anyway, it again gave the big popularity to this Nasrallah. It got to a point, this is not just in Lebanon, beyond Lebanon in the Arab world. He was so popular, got to a point that a sheikh, and forgive me, I forget if he's Morocco or Algeria, he said, you Muslims do not understand the Quran. Read the Quran. Allah said, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. He's talking about Nasrallah, Hassan Nasrallah. It got to this point that Hassan Nasrallah, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ, he said, you guys do not understand your Quran. I forget again if he's a Moroccan or an Algerian sheikh. But this gives you a sample of where things got with Hezbollah and Nasrallah, that the support, those are fighting the Israelis. Those are standing, against this occupation and this and this and this and that. After the skirmishes of the fights of 2006, I should not call it skirmishes, it was a war that lasted about 33 days. There was an understanding. Keep this word in mind, an understanding as a result of that war agreement between Hezbollah and the Israelis, with the US in between. With the US in between, that basically from now on we need to live and let the other live. We do not want to have wars. You have your space in Lebanon, we have our space in Palestine, and let's deal with it that way. And this agreement lasted until the war started in Gaza. This tafahumat, understanding with the help of the US. Now Hezbollah did two things that really let the Arab world take another look at them. In Lebanon, we said that there was the French influence and the American influence. So the Americans came after the Civil War, got the different parties to agree to something called a Ta'if Agreement. Ta'if in Saudi, they called it a Ta'if Agreement, by which the Prime Minister of Lebanon start to have a major role. In fact, to even shadow the president. Meaning that the Christians' influence start going down, that is the French influence, and the Muslim influence start going up before this Hezbollah took over Lebanon. The Ta'if Agreement. And the main person who became the representative of the Muslims in Lebanon, Sunni and Shia at one point in the beginning, that he represent the Muslims in this regard, although there are some, Nabih Barri was still there. He's still there, by the way. Nabih Barri, I think he's in his 90s, he's still the Speaker of the Parliament. And Al-Hariri have really given Muslims in Lebanon a jolt. He's a billionaire, starts sending Muslims to America and Europe to study and putting his own money with this investment. He was so popular. And Hezbollah, with the support of Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafez Assad, had a plan to kill al-Hariri, and they did. They assassinate al-Hariri through a bomb. The courts have spoken. This is Hezbollah action. That was a major sign that, those guys are for something else. Now, when al-Hariri was assassinated, there was an uproar in Lebanon, and Syria was forced to withdraw from Lebanon. Since Syria invaded Lebanon in the 70s, they controlled everything. If the Shiites raised their head, they hit the Shiites. If the Christians raised their head, they hit the Christians. If the Sunnis raised their head, they were the dominant force. Their mukhabarat, their intelligence service, was in control of the politicians of Lebanon, not just the people of Lebanon. So many assassinations in Lebanon, so many over the years. So after Hariri was killed, Syria was forced to withdraw from Lebanon. Who filled the vacuum that was left? Of course, Hezbollah. No one else. The state cannot fill that vacuum in Lebanon. Things went on until 2011. We are getting to a close. In 2011, the so-called Arab Spring started, and the people went to the streets asking for a change. This was also included in Syria. And the Syrian government, really the way they handle it is just the same police mentality. They release many of the young Muslim activists who were familiar with arms from the time of Iraq. They were imprisoned in Syria. They released them, and a war started in Syria, where basically the army disintegrated and the Sunni left the army. The Alawite, who's a kuffar group who are in control of Lebanon, of Syria, just like the Maronites in control of Lebanon for all those years. And it's not coincidental that in Israel, no Palestine, now the Israeli in control. In Lebanon, they gave it to the Maronites, and they gave Syria to the Alawis, who are again Kuffar group, historically very well known. They used to call the Nusayris. So the Bilad al-Sham, except with Jordan, who were left to the Hashemites, who were again loyal to the British, and they gave up Palestine without a fight in 1967. This is a fact. They gave Palestine to the Jews in 1967 without a fight, because Palestine was under their rule. So Bilad al-Sham really became a base for kufr in the Middle East in this regard. So Bashar al-Assad was in trouble. The Syrian army disintegrated. The Syrian government was really facing a serious threat. Suddenly Hezbollah came into Lebanon and started massacring the Sunni Muslims. There were massacres that took place to support Bashar al-Assad. And the Iranians also came and put their weight behind Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad regime became stable. And Syria was divided. Now, at that point, the US could not really send big army into Syria for historical reasons and more. So the US have this agreement with the Russians that the Russians will take militarily over Syria to do what? To prevent Iran from taking Syria. The Iranians do not have love for Bashar al-Assad and company. The Iranians want to take over Syria. And they sent their Revolutionary Guard, and they brought Hezbollah, they brought Shiites from Afghanistan, they brought Shiites from Lebanon, from the Iraq to fight in Syria. Their aim was to take over Syria. And Bashar al-Assad, of course, seeing this, the US seeing this, Russia was invaded to take over, so Russia now occupy Syria to really limit the influence of Iran in Syria. So going back to link with the original subject, the Israeli government decided to shift the focus from Gaza to Lebanon. And this understanding that I mentioned, the Israeli army decided to break this understanding. So they sent 5,000 small bombs to Hezbollah. Basically pagers and walkie-talkies. They established an Israeli company which gave the impression that this is a legit company. Somehow Hezbollah bought 2,000 plus pagers and 2,000 plus walkie-talkies. And in one day, 2,000 of them went off. Imagine, I mean, this is Leon Panetta, who is the head of the CIA at one point, called this a terrorist attack. Did you hear Saudi saying this is a terrorist attack? Or Jordan? Did you hear Egypt calling this a terrorist attack? Leon Panetta, the head of CIA, said this is a terrorist attack. Why? You are sending 5,000 small bombs so that somebody is sitting with his wife and children, it goes off, and who's injured? Somebody is sitting with their parents. Somebody is in the marketplace. Somebody is in the masjid making salah. 5,000 bombs over 2 days go just immediately, one after the other. This day, 2,000 plus, and this day, 2,000 plus. So that was the first indication that something serious is happening. And suddenly, Israel knows where is the leadership of Hezbollah. So they start killing them one after the other. One of the main figures was Fuad Shukr, who was a big name within Hezbollah. And Hassan Nasrallah came and said, we're going to show them. We're going to let them cry. We're going to let them do. And nothing. Just sending a few missiles. Now remember, Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles. Some of them very precise and strong. So far you did not see them. And the disaster came when a bait was given to the leadership of Hezbollah after assassinating so many of their leaders in the past 2 weeks only. Or I should say 3 weeks. I'm sorry, 3 weeks. So they gave them a bait and they took it. So basically, Netanyahu is going to New York, and there was this discussion about a ceasefire in Lebanon. So the US government worked this ceasefire with France and with Netanyahu agreed to it. The American government and the French came with this resolution. We're going to have a 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon. And the right-wingers, who are more extreme than Netanyahu's government, says, if you take this ceasefire, we will not vote with the coalition. And if you insist on following it, we'll bring the government down. Suddenly, Netanyahu, this is the culture of سماعون الكذب. The Zionists, it's not just they lie, they live by the lies. They listen to the lies. They do not, they do not enjoy the truth. سماعون للكذب. This is the culture of lies that they have. Suddenly Netanyahu said, what ceasefire? I do not know about this ceasefire. I do not support this ceasefire. I will not. And the American government, Kirby and the speaker said, we walked this with details with Netanyahu. So there was this debate. He went to New York. He said, when he arrived in New York, we are still considering the ceasefire and we are talking about it. And Hezbollah leadership thought, there's talk about ceasefire, there's this talk, Netanyahu in New York, we are safe. So the leadership met in a bunker in Beirut. And you know the rest of the story. The Israelis bombed it and took over the leadership of Hezbollah. Now, Hashim Safiyuddin, who's the cousin of Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, became the leader. He is his protege. Both of them have studied in Iraq and in Qum in Iran, and he have also total loyalty to Iran. Hezbollah is in front of two choices. Either they can respond with a strong response and start bombing seriously. So far, they are not bombing seriously. I mean, a missile here and a missile there, a missile there, does not count. If you start bombing Tel Aviv and Tel Aviv airport, as the Yemenis have done, that's where the Israelis will invade and full war will break between Hezbollah and Lebanon. Or the Hezbollah will absorb this, give a mute response, accept this reality, and try to have a new arrangement because they are not going to sacrifice their gains in Lebanon. For Hezbollah, there is no doubt that Lebanon and their presence in Lebanon and their influence in Lebanon is more than Palestine and liberating Palestine. That's a fact. If somebody sees otherwise, they do not know what they're talking about. Inshallah, time for the adhan. We'll see you inshallah next week. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Still straighten your lines, close the gaps. Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين وإذ قال إبراهيم رب اجعل هذا البلد آمنا واجنبني وبني أن نعبد الأصنام رب إنهن أضللن كثيرا من الناس فمن تبعني فإنه مني ومن عصاني فإنك غفور رحيم ربنا إني أسكنت من ذريتي بواد غير ذي زرع عند بيتك المحرم ربنا ليقيموا الصلاة فاجعل أفئدة من الناس تهوي إليهم وارزقهم من الثمرات لعلهم يشكرون ربنا إنك تعلم ما نخفي وما نعلن وما يخفى على الله من شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء الحمد لله الذي وهب لي على الكبر إسماعيل وإسحاق إن ربي لسميع الدعاء ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. الأخلاء يومئذ بعضهم لبعض عدو إلا المتقين. يا عباد لا خوف عليكم اليوم ولا أنتم تحزنون الذين آمنوا بآياتنا وكانوا مسلمين. ادخلوا الجنة أنتم وأزواجكم تحبرون يطاف عليهم بصحاف من ذهب وأكواب وفيها ما تشتهيه الأنفس وتلذ الأعين وأنتم فيها خالدون. وتلك الجنة التي أورثتموها بما كنتم تعملون لكم فيها فاكهة كثيرة منها تأكلون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.